Thank you for joining us. I'm Shiza Malik, and on behalf of Oxfam and Asia Centre, I welcome you to this media forum on vaccine inequality and worsening inequalities in Asia. The purpose of today's event is twofold. One is to launch this year's round of our Journalism for Equitable Asia Award, and second is to shed light on this issue of unequal access to vaccines and how that is deepening and worsening other forms of inequality in Asia. This is, of course, an important aspect of this year's theme for the award, which is Inequality, a Threat to Lives and Livelihoods. Our panelists today are Max Lawson, who is the head of Inequality Policy at Oxfam and co-chair of the People's Vaccine Alliance, Inkara Mukatova, who is the program officer for Civil Society Development Organization, and James Gomez, who is the regional director for the Asia Center. Since we have only a little over an hour together, without further delay, I will invite Max to start today's discussion by telling us why vaccine justice is so important to our world today. Over to you, Max.
Good morning, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. And how long have I got, Shiza?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, right. Fantastic. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join this seminar. So my name is Max Lawson. I'm the head of Inequality Policy for Oxfam International. And I'm going to say a little bit about inequality and the relationship between inequality and vaccines and vaccine access. So I think the first thing to understand is that it's almost certain now that the coronavirus pandemic is going to increase economic inequality and many other inequalities, gender, racial, but primarily economic inequality. The gap between rich and poor is going to increase dramatically because of COVID-19 in almost every country in the world. And that's the first time in history that that has ever happened. We've had increases in some countries, decreases in others, but this is a simultaneous increase. And why is that? Because we all know the impact of lockdowns, the impact of recessions are felt hardest by the poorest, by women, by indigenous people, by those at the bottom, those who don't have the safety net to cope. And then you've also got a situation where rich country governments have much, much more money to support their people through the crisis. So you're having an impact on the inequality between rich countries and developing nations, and then also within nations, the gap between rich and poor. And then at the top, it's important to understand that the richest people in the world, including many of the billionaires that live in Asia, have seen their wealth dramatically increase during COVID-19. In the first month, they suffered a loss, but ever since that, you've seen this stratospheric increase in the wealth of the very richest people. And that is unprecedented. We've seen billionaire wealth grow more in the last 15 months than it has in the last 15 years. So it's important to understand that you've seen this huge gap. So then where do vaccines come into that? So, I mean, you can see that the rich nations of the world have hoarded the vaccines. That's a clear and obvious thing that's happening in the world. But behind that is another story, a story of monopoly power and corporate power, which is reducing the supply of vaccines across the whole world. So we see a situation where most of the most successful Western vaccines were the product of public money, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money, funding research, funding the production of these vaccines before they even knew they were safe. So in some ways, it was a miracle of science and organization that they risked billions of dollars to produce these vaccines, not even knowing whether they would be successful. And then they were successful and are still successful in combating the virus, but they were handed over to huge pharmaceutical corporations as an effective monopoly. So you have a monopoly on some of the most successful vaccines, notably the Pfizer vaccine, which is produced by Pfizer together with a German company, BioNTech. It's the most successful Western vaccine, and is also the most profitable drug in history. It's made absolutely billions of dollars for Pfizer and BioNTech. It's created new vaccine billionaires that we never had before. And we calculated just 2 weeks ago that Pfizer, BioNTech are making $1,000 profit a second from their vaccine, a vaccine that was produced using public money. Why does this matter? I mean, firms have to make money, firms have to make a return. No one, the People's Vaccine or anyone else, is suggesting that companies should not make a profit. But what we're talking about here is profiteering behind a monopoly. So using your monopoly to charge very high prices. And that's why we then have a situation of vaccine inequality across the world, because the richest countries with the deepest pockets and the closest political connections are the ones that can force their way to the front of the vaccine queue, meaning that the developing countries, and particularly the poorest developing countries in Africa and parts of Asia, have been unable to access the vaccine supplies at anything like the scale and speed of the richer nations. And so that means that a year and a half into the pandemic, a year and 3 quarters into the pandemic, the main obstacle to beating this disease is no longer science. It has not been science for a year. The obstacle to beating this disease is inequality, and inequality of access, inequality of power, and the inequality created by monopolies. So what the People's Vaccine Campaign is demanding, and in doing this, we're adding support to the call by over 100 nations, including many nations in Asia, for a waiver of intellectual property on vaccines and treatments and technologies relating to COVID-19 during the pandemic. What would this do? This would enable successful and pre-qualified vaccine manufacturers all over Asia, all over Latin America and in Africa to produce these miraculous vaccines by themselves, and not having to rely on the charity of Germany or the US or the donations that never come, or the largesse of a big corporation like Pfizer. Instead, they would have the right and the freedom to produce their own vaccines and flood the world with cheap and effective vaccines to beat this disease. So there's a clear link between these issues of monopoly, patents, and vaccine inequality. And the People's Vaccine is about fighting for the ability of developing countries to stand on their own 2 feet and manufacture their own vaccines. Only this week we were discussing with a manufacturer in Vietnam, as one example, who in May of this year said that they were willing, they came forward to the WHO and said they were willing to work with Pfizer or with Moderna to produce mRNA vaccines. They have the capability, and they said within 6 months they could be producing over 100 million doses. They were ignored. The Pfizers and Modernas of this world had no interest in working with these developing country producers. It was exactly the same with the hub in South Africa and many other producers that have come forward. These are viable companies all over Asia that could be producing vaccines as we speak. So that's why we have to fight for the opening up of patents so we can end this vaccine inequality, which is having these knock-on impacts on the global economy. So you're now seeing a 2-speed global economy with rich countries that are fully vaccinated pulling ahead. And for the first time in 20 years, you're seeing the gap between the rich world and the poor world grow once again. So that's a terrible impact of vaccine inequality. And that's why we're coming together as the People's Vaccine. And just to finish, to see in the next week, we have a crucial meeting in Geneva of the World Trade Organization. All the nations will be represented. This issue of vaccine inequality and waiving patents will be at top of the agenda. Developing countries will be fighting for the waiver to be passed. The United States has supported it, but so far the European Union has steadfastly opposed, and particularly led by Germany. So any pressure that can be put on the German government, on European Union ambassadors, on the leaders of Europe in the coming week will help to pressurize them to do the right thing and not put monopolies and profit ahead of people's lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Max. That was very insightful and reflects on the urgency of the need to advocate for a waiver on vaccine patents. I encourage everybody to drop their questions and comments in the chat box, and we can discuss them towards the end when we have some time left from after our speakers are done speaking. I now invite Inkara to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted people in Central Asia and what vaccine inequality means for the region and what the vaccine rollout is looking like. Over to you, Inkara.
Thank you very much, Shiza, and thank you very much, first of all, to our colleagues from Oxfam International and Asia Center for bringing this up and having the voices of Central Asia in this important discussion. I think it's been almost a year since the first COVID vaccine rollout started, and today we are lucky to have several approved vaccines. But at the same time, global rollout has raised many questions over supply, logistics, administration, and inequality. So the challenge now is not that only with the developing vaccines, but also making sure that the one who should get the vaccine does so. And vaccination planning in Central Asia has been also a big challenge. No country in the region so far could claim for a success on this. So far, Kazakhstan is a regional leader on vaccinations, but that's not saying much because the vaccine rollouts in the region have been at a very slow basis relatively to Western countries or even to some of the Asian countries. For understandable economic and geopolitical reasons, Kazakhstan was forced to choose the Russian vaccine, Sputnik, to vaccinate its citizens. But at the same time, the Kazakhstan launched its own vaccine called Kazvak, and it claimed for a 96% of efficiency. The Kazakh authorities decided it was fine to start using this vaccine, even though the trial phase was still ongoing. But the problem with Kazvak that there is not much information about this vaccine. The government shares no details on how it was developed, as well as results of clinical trials. So people in Kazakhstan locally, they have doubts about this drug and are not willing to take this vaccine. Well, currently, the situation is more or less under control with the supply. Russian, Chinese vaccines are all on offer, including the domestically developed one. And also, Kazakhstan has signed a deal with Pfizer to purchase 4 million doses for its population. Well, the biggest challenge in the region also remains in Turkmenistan. The Turkmen government maintains that it has not detected any cases of COVID so far. But however, as it was mentioned by the WHO, it's even from a scientific point of view, it's unlikely that the virus is not circulating in the country. But Turkmenistan government has a long history of suppressing the right of freedom of expression and access to information. But at the same time, access to information equates to access to useful, like crucial health information. Because Turkmenistan denies it has recorded any cases of people, local citizens, they have to look somewhere else for indication of epidemiological situation. And because of this challenging situation, it's impossible to know about the current state of the virus in the country. Number of cases, deaths, and vaccination rates, this all information is not available at all. While country mentioned that is willing to participate in COVAX initiative, it's not known whether it made any orders. We are not aware if the government actions if there are any government actions related to the pandemic. Well, the country still remains a part of global trade, and existing global challenges will definitely exaggerate existing social economic challenges in the country. And unfortunately, the victim of all of this is a local population. who's having their rights to health disregarded by the government. Well, the rest of the countries, namely Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, they are eligible for access to vaccine supplies through COVAX. And but the problem with COVAX that delivers are very slow. For example, Kyrgyzstan have so far vaccinated only 13% of its population. Well, but that's not even enough to vaccinate health workers who have been on the front line and also those at greater risk. In addition, not all the vaccines are equally manageable. For example, Deputy Health Minister of Kyrgyzstan, he was quite skeptical about the ability of the country to accept Pfizer vaccine, given the extremely cold storage requirements. So that the refrigerator cost would be very high, and there are not budgets for this. And I think this example also demonstrates another inequality in the vaccine system, because global government on vaccination to some extent unresponsive to the needs of the countries like Kyrgyzstan. Well, they take steps unilaterally and not having their ear what's going on at the local level. But the biggest problem with vaccination in Central Asia, it's not a supply, I would say, but more of like local logistics and vaccine hesitancy, which was extremely high in the region and which posed a significant threat to public health. Among the main reasons of vaccine hesitancy in Central Asia was about its safety. While people with pre-existing conditions all over the world are prioritized for vaccination, here in Central Asia, they're more likely to be hesitant to get vaccinated. And this hesitancy led to another big challenge in the country, which is a vaccination certificate without vaccination. So the country faced the prevalence of fake vaccine certificates, which has demonstrated a high level of corruption in health system. And it was very easy to get and hard to trace. And the government so far initiated more than 65 criminal cases on over false vaccination certificates. I think another challenge also, this is especially the case for countries, is a failure to recognize certain vaccines by the World Health Organization. This is the case for Russian Sputnik V vaccine. The majority of people here took this vaccine, but if we differentiate the vaccines between themselves based on WHO acceptance, I think we are creating some new inequalities. We know that there is a lack of trial data about this vaccine, which also exaggerates vaccines inequality. Well, and in conclusion, I would just say that mass vaccination campaigns present logistical challenges everywhere. And as can be seen, local and middle-income countries, they face particular challenges. But ensuring equal access would require continuous commitment, collaboration, and global solidarity. But I think it's also very important to appreciate the generous donations from financial contribution from partners to COVAX. I think we have been able to witness this solidarity here in Central Asia. 3 of our countries are eligible for this. We just need to redouble our efforts and to ensure equitable COVID-19 vaccine availability. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Inkara. I think you touched upon a lot of very interesting aspects of vaccine inequality and vaccine inequity and what it looks like within countries and in how it plays out in a region. I again encourage our participants to keep sharing their questions here in the chat box. But just to touch upon one, I think, aspect of vaccine inequality and that's much discussed in countries these days is vaccine hesitancy. What role do you think that media can play in vaccine in countering vaccine hesitancy, because we find that it is sometimes used as an excuse to sort of explain away the rates of vaccinations within countries, to say that, okay, people are not, they don't want the vaccine, that's why they're not getting it. So what do you think can be done to counter vaccine hesitancy within countries?
Sorry, was it me? I missed it. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think, well, first of all, public awareness raising is very important, because I don't know about the other regions here. This information is quite serious. I think this is very important, to share the trial phases, that was needed to do by the country at the beginning stage, to share as much information as possible, scientifically approved information, and yeah, I think all the communities need to be mobilized, and also I think here it's very important the role of civil society, who usually has this access to local communities, and it's extremely important that they share right and useful information.
Thank you, Inkara. So we will keep the rest of the questions for the end of the discussion. I now invite James Gomez to talk about COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 in the Southeast Asian region, and what vaccine inequality is looking like, and how the vaccine rollout is progressing, because I know it's progressing very fast in the region. So James, over to you. And also please do tell us about this year's Journalism for Equitable Asia Award, and the role media can play in highlighting vaccine and other forms of inequality in Asia. Over to you, James.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shiza. I will make three points about inequality. The first one is about inequality within countries, how that looks like. I think we spoke a lot about regional, sub-regional, global comparison in relation to states. I wanted to give you a window into inequalities, everyday inequalities that we faced, which is not unique to Asia or Southeast Asia, and perhaps we can reflect on this. I mean, in the early days of the vaccine rollout, I think we saw a stark divide between access to vaccine between citizens and foreigners. And foreigners could range from, documented and undocumented workers, refugees, and even those with resident permits in a particular country. We found in many of these countries, in addition to not having vaccines, when they had vaccines, they prioritized their citizens. So I think that's one observation to take note of. A second observation in talking about, in-country, inequalities in terms of administrating vaccines, you had privileged groups. For example, families of military personnel, families of health workers, they were able to, bypass, existing protocols and create preference or quick access to family members and acquaintances. This also included, businesses that may have had, priority vaccination quotas given to them because of the nature of the business, and then they would sell these vaccine quotas to people who are not their employees, simply because as the COVID-19 virus broke out, many, foreign staff went back to their country. So companies that had, large foreign staff quotas had this vaccine access, and they used to, give unequal priority. So I think it's important to recognize in country inequalities. There were also attempts to acquire vaccines directly. Private health groups sometimes, try to bypass government protocols about direct acquisition. You have also the many attempts to manufacture vaccines locally. You have examples of the Indonesian military, experimenting on the Nusantara vaccine option in Indonesia, and in Thailand you have a local university and a monarchy-related company looking and seeking, special access in producing vaccines. So I wanted to kind of just touch on those elements. I will now turn to the interregional comparisons of how vaccine rates are progressing. In a study that Asia Center was part of, and it worked with colleagues from the sub-regions, and of course we have one of our friends and collaborators, Inkara, from Central Asia, with whom we collaborated. The main thing that we observed was the death rates in Asia, broadly comparing the 4 sub-regions of Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Northeast Asia, and South Asia, was the lower the vaccine rates, the higher the death rates and infection rates per 1 million. So these were the hard stats that was compiled across regional studies. Asia in general, the numbers have moved since what I'm sharing with you on the screen. We have 80 million people in the larger Asia region infected, and we are the 3rd largest region after North America and Europe, with over 1,150,000 deaths across the region. Although vaccination rates are, on a daily basis creeping up, and I think we are now just a touch above 40. So it's only about 40% across the whole region that has been vaccinated 2 doses. And if I can draw your attention to the right-hand column from where I'm sitting, and if you look at vaccination rates, you can see that in North Asia leads with over 50%. Southeast Asia is a fast second in that regard, at 35%. And South Asia is, just touch behind at 34%, and Central Asia still lags behind at 21%. Just with a caveat, the population sizes of these different regions vary, and also that, it's been about a few weeks since this data was compiled, so the numbers would have inched up slightly. We have been talking about vaccine, but I think it's also important to note the booster shots. Some of the richer countries have already, started rolling out booster shots. For example, Singapore has already, allocated, quotas and sent out notices to all residents living in Singapore to sort of begin their queues and application to avail themselves of the booster shots. So I have mentioned inequality in terms of within the country. I have mentioned inequality across the sub-regions of Asia. I now want to touch briefly on inequality. I want to take off from what Max said about, the breadth of inequalities COVID-19 has inflicted upon, humanity. In this regard, I also want to mention democratic inequality, with a special mention to how it has affected CSOs as well as the media. In terms of CSOs, I think COVID-19 really affected their resource allocation, and CSOs work on a whole range of issues, and especially those CSOs that were trying to help the vulnerable during this period found, many of their resources cut, and they also had trouble, coming on board quickly on the digital bandwagon as things, moved in that direction. In the same vein, I also want to mention the impact on media, especially independent online media. If they suffered resources, they had a drop in subscription, and many of them, had to, appealed for crowd funding and oftentimes not very successfully in terms of the media. So I wanted to mention this so that I'll use this as a platform to introduce the award. The award, which is in its third year, in a close partnership with Oxfam International. The award is called Journalism for an Equitable Asia. This year's theme is around vaccine inequality, and I think across all the three speakers we have, discussed many dimensions of it. And if you're a journalist, in Asia, working on these issues, this is an opportunity for you to showcase your work. And we want to encourage the good work you do and help us put the spotlight on this very, very important issue. So the nominations have been open since last week. So we have already had interest and some applications have already come in. So we are looking forward to receive applications from all over the region. The awards can be submitted online. We will send you a link here in the chat. The journalists, you can self-nominate, and your others can just also nominate you independently. The key thing to take note is, to submit your articles online. Please indicate your media affiliation, your contact information, including a WhatsApp number, so we could be very closely be in touch with you as we go through the process of the nomination. And if we have any queries, we can reach out to you, because we want to ensure that your submissions are successfully submitted, and if there are any kinks, we can, support you. In order to qualify, you would have to have published 2 articles in this calendar year, which is 2021 to right up to 2022, end of January. The articles need to be in English. If they are written in another language, translations are welcome in English, and a minimum word count of 650 words. We are looking forward to articles that specifically during this time, look at the health inequality arising from COVID-19 and a special, attention on vaccine allocation. We invite, all types of, focus and perspective on these issues. Just to give you a top line sense of how the judging criteria will take place, I will not go into detail, but we judge the articles on thematic relevance, social relevance, and value alignment, and also is the technical expertise displayed in the articles. All this information is online, and you can access them through the link. Both Asia Centre and Oxfam International will be ready to answer any questions that you might have to support you in your submission. There will be top 3 winners with cash awards. There'll be 10 shortlisted nominees who will be invited to attend an award ceremony in Bangkok. And 11th and 5th places would also receive a merit certificate. The following are the timelines. Once again, the nominations are open. They have started since last week, and this activity in part is also to announce that the nominations are open and to invite submissions. Submissions will continue on a rolling basis until 31st January next year, and the planned award ceremony will be on the 22nd of March, and we expect attendees to arrive on the 21st of March. As it stands now, Thailand is now open for fully vaccinated travelers. Things are shifting, so we will update you in terms of, travel protocols closer to time. I think that's all from my end. So over to you, Shiza.
Thank you so much for that, James. I really hope that today's event will encourage coverage by journalists across Asia on this very important issue, because While we know that there is various forms of vaccine inequality within countries and across the region, we are not seeing that much coverage of that issue, these kind of issues in the media. And I really hope that today's event will be an opportunity for journalists to think about it more and to cover this issue within their particular contexts. James, you have touched upon a lot of interesting aspects of vaccine inequality and how it's playing out within countries. I'll just pick up on one of the things you said about the impact of COVID-19 on freedom of civic space in Asia, a region where we already know that civic spaces are restricted, and increasingly we're seeing a kind of tightening of kind of controls on journalism and other forms of freedoms of expression. Do you want to talk about this a little bit more and what it's looking like right now?
Thank you very much, Shiza. That's a very important point, especially as it relates to the media and journalism. Rightly so, I think at the start of the pandemic, there were concerns about misinformation related to the coronavirus. And it's an important point to recognize that this is a genuine concern. There were misrepresentation about the origins of the disease. There was concerns about what kind of remedies would be effective, and so on and so forth. So governments, around the region took attempts to deal with what they called infodemic, the extensive amount of information related to the COVID-19, specifically misinformation. Now, some countries, just a few in the larger Asia region, had some laws around fake news and disinformation, and they, sort of used some of these. But most countries relied on special temporary COVID-19 laws, as well as emergency decrees, all of which contain some provision to deal with fake news. However, what we witnessed on the ground was really that governments were, more concerned about managing their political narrative. So governments came under a lot of pressure because, the issue was new, the health pandemic in the manner that it rolled out was challenging. So they made a lot of missteps and they were subject to a lot of, criticism. So in order to deal with the criticism, they took a blanket approach and applied these fake news laws, and primarily directed at journalists who asked the hard questions, and then also to those who use social media to voice their concern. So as a result, media and journalism took a hard hit. There were many who were incarcerated and prosecuted, and it also gave rise to self-censorship. So we are hoping that by also additionally drawing a spotlight on this issue, we could also, bring into focus the important contribution quality journalism, fact-based journalism can bring to the discussion and knowledge around how to deal with this pandemic. Over to you, Shiza.
Thank you, James. And just to add to that, as we see vaccine rollout progressing in countries, we're also seeing a lot of apps by governments and initiatives around that involved collection of data from citizens under the guise of COVID-19 vaccination and public safety. But of course, that raises concerns about surveillance and data protection as well. So how that pans out and what that means for freedom of expression in Asia and data protection in Asia really has to be seen. Thank you for that. My next question is more in general. I think Inkara touched upon this a little bit, and so did James, about how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted marginalized groups. And in particular, I would like to talk about how it's impacted women in Asia and what vaccine inequality or lack of access to vaccines has meant for women who are poor Asian women. The floor is open for either Inkara or James to take it, or maybe Mustafa would like to comment on this.
Thank you, Shiza. Well, I can mention about the situation in Central Asia. I think in general, because of our cultural aspects and mentality, women in general are facing some difficulties with promoting their rights and freedoms. But the COVID-19 for sure exaggerated the existing challenges, because women in Kazakhstan, they constitute the majority of health workers in the region. At the same time, women have to take care of their, families and kids. Also, there's some right to education and right to work, decent work still remains at a very low level. This is additional burden by the COVID-19 pandemic for women, because as I said, they had to do many things, and at the same time, I think it's existing fact that gender-based violence was increased during the pandemic, and here in Central Asia countries we had this growing unfortunate statistics about this as well. Yeah.
From Southeast Asia in particular, I would like to draw attention to the plight and challenges faced by domestic workers. And I want to kind of just provide some contours around it. The women here were both documented and undocumented domestic workers. If I can take the case of Thailand, there was a fair bit of domestic workers who came as a family unit. So the men tend to work in construction, and then women, worked as domestic workers. And when the COVID broke, the family unit got displaced, jobs were lost. So the women also couldn't generate income. So this is from the case of Thailand. If I can switch the same focus to Malaysia, in Malaysia, there was a form of movement in trying to criminalize those who are undocumented. So women domestic workers were also additionally targeted as well. And if I can, on the same vein, shift to Singapore, domestic workers, in a very highly urbanized environment, living in small accommodation, and where everybody was confined at home, domestic workers faced even further pressure in the household because suddenly they were having to work and care for a larger number of people in the same household who were there 24 hours for an extended period of time. And with the additional curfew in terms of travels and social distancing and the inability to leave the homes or premises, domestic workers already hard put in not having days off were further in turn literally for weeks and months on end with large number of family members whom they cared for, as well as in very close places. So I wanted to kind of just, paint a picture of how domestic workers, female domestic workers, experience challenges both in places like Thailand, Malaysia, and then in also very urban Singapore.
Thank you so much, James. I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of and the struggles of women domestic workers in Asia, because that is, of course, they have been deeply impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I have a question here from Nipuna, but before I do that, Mustafa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe briefly.
Yes, please.
I think COVID-19 has impacted on two fronts. One, of course, is the health, very critical, and the second one is the income losses, as James was mentioning. So as last year, we also, with the support of journalists, we had collected the stories of informal workers, that how they have been affected. And as we all know, that 2/3 of labor force work in Asia and Pacific is informal workers, and majority of them are women. So they were hit hard as lockdowns. Many governments put the lockdowns to contain the virus and pandemic. So the daily wage workers, small producers were affected as the markets were shut down. And also in several places, the food security situation was also was an issue in many of the Asian countries. But on the other side, there's a negligence of the governments. Had there been an effective health system and a social security system in place, the effect of this pandemic could have been very less. And we saw some governments coming quickly on supporting and providing social assistance, but the health systems were completely collapsed, as you have seen in India, for example, as the cases increased. And then there was also an indecisiveness of the governments to buy the vaccine, to this vaccine, that vaccine. I think Thailand is the classic case in that case, as James also put it. So this indecisiveness of the government's unpreparedness, less investment in the social assistance programs and the health systems. So when this pandemic hit, the lower strata of the population, majority of them were women, small peasants, landless laborers, daily wage workers, and small businesses, of course, in urban areas, mostly belonging to the service industry and the tourism sector, were hit hard because there were months-long shutdowns of those businesses, and these small businesses do not have that much financial capability and cushion to support their employees for a long time. So I think these were the major, and these are going to create a further inequality, because these people need a lot of time and efforts to recoup in comparison to their rich peers who quickly bounce back. So I think these are the important issues that we would really like the colleagues from the media who can explore in their respective countries and areas to dig deeper and to bring the human faces and angle to this important story. Over.
Thank you so much for that, Mustafa. I invite any participants who wish to participate and ask their questions directly to just raise your hand, and you can join in the discussion. The floor is open to anyone. I invite Nipuna, who had a question for our panelists, to, if you want to ask. I think Mustafa covered a bit of what you were asking, but please do join in.
Yeah, thanks, Shiza. I think Mustafa kind of set it up quite beautifully. I mean, a lot of the governments have been woefully incompetent in how they handled, and the authoritarian tendencies have not really helped. So my question really is building upon what Mustafa said, for this kind of, for them putting short-term gains, the kind of money, popularity and allegiances ahead of well-being of people. How can we hold them to account? I mean, in Brazil, there's a case that the Senate decided to indict Bolsonaro for his gross mishandling. But if you look at several countries, including Sri Lanka, where I come from, and India, and most of Southeast Asia, really. But how can we play a role in holding them to account? And I also had a second question. the pandemic continues, and now we're talking about booster shots, and several governments, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and others possibly have already agreed to purchase drugs from Pfizer and Merck. So how can we kind of help the countries to adapt how they distribute this, how they prioritize more vulnerable populations as opposed to, their cronies and friends? So I guess those are the two questions.
Thanks so much for that, Nipuna. Who would like to answer that very important question? Mustafa, perhaps? Or James? Okay, James, please.
Yeah, I think that the many moving parts to a very complex set of questions. So perhaps we can unpack it a little at a time. But just for trying to bring attention to this one particular point, I think that has not come up is the pandemic treaty. I think that there is movement now to at the international UN level to have a kind of a treaty, to deal with health crises, pandemics, and so on and so forth. And from sitting here in Southeast Asia, we don't see much awareness and discussion. And I think trying to bring attention to that issue in the region and getting more voices, articulating, or pushing governments to sign up, responsibly and take those measures into account that we are all, highlighting here today, maybe one way to go. In terms of booster shots, I think there's also the question of affordability. So from the Singapore context, from a resource point of view, it has, and also from a public relations point of view, from day one, it has made, access without cost, both vaccines and boosters available for all that are resident in Singapore. So that's quite clear. But the countries, further up the poverty level, they have challenges. We don't speak about Myanmar because we don't know enough in terms of what has been happening post-coup. But from the intel we get from friends who are inside the country, I mean, things are dire. I mean, the health system has collapsed. And I think for me, if we are, looking at the region and Southeast Asia, I would also, try to, pay more attention and put a spotlight on Myanmar. Shiza, I'll just pass this over to you so you can ask the other friends some reaction, and I'm happy to come back to brainstorm Nipuna's question about how can we hold those in power accountable to do the right thing. Over to you, Shiza.
Thanks, James. Would any of our other panelists like to address this question?
Well, I will just mention that the Brazil case is also the case for Central Asia, because in 3 of our countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and I guess Tajikistan, the health minister were dismissed because of failing in this process. But I think that's not the way to. I mean, this is not there's no single formula to solve this problem. And in terms of getting them to account, I think we need to have this monitor compliance in place, and be involved in vaccine distribution related services, maybe civil society, and work with audit and anti-corruption agencies using some participatory methods. So it's extremely important to involve civil society in this process. Yeah, thank you. And in terms of booster shots, I think so far Kazakhstan is the only country who has launched the booster shots, would be available soon and maybe in December. But for Western vaccines, we have to purchase. I mean, we have to pay for that because they're not available for citizens, only for vulnerable groups. But the others would have to pay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Inkara. Does anybody else wish to comment? Yeah, just to add to what our panelists said, I think one important aspect is spending on healthcare and free and universal access to healthcare, which we don't see across Asia. There's great variation in people's access to healthcare, and of course, how that panned out during the COVID-19 pandemic was pretty obvious in certain countries where there's a lot of privatization of healthcare. We saw that those people who were able to afford better healthcare for themselves were able to get beds during the crisis, while the poor were literally dying on the streets. So of course, moving forward as we recover from the pandemic, this is an important, all of us as citizens need to call for free and universal healthcare from our governments and increased spending on social services. And of course, our journalists have a huge role to play in this. And the more stories we highlight from the impact of this crisis on people in Asia, the more likely we are to see change in the future. With that, I think we're almost at time. I would like to invite Mustafa to make a few closing comments. And over to you, Mustafa.
Thank you, Shiza. I'm really thankful to Asia Center, and it's great that this partnership is continuing for our third cycle of the Equitable Asia Media Award. And also great to see Nipuna joining, who actually started this project. I'm also thankful the media colleagues who have joined this introductory webinar. I think the main purpose of this was to introduce you and provide you with some ideas where we stand today with the vaccine issue and how is it linked with overall economic inequality that Max talked about. You are working closely, of course, with your countries, with people you're closely linked with that. You know more better than we know. But we just wanted to share with you a few ideas of how global politics is playing around, what are the key issues with the intellectual property rights and sharing the vaccine technology for mass production, and how it's affecting the developing countries and how its cost may be going up of the vaccines, but also the drugs and other therapeutic technologies that in due course may be developed. So, as James mentioned, the theme for the third cycle of Equitable Asia Media Award that Oxfam and Asia Center has been working, and unfortunately, as we started this award, the pandemic hit. So we really don't had a chance to meet during the award ceremony in 2 cycles, but we are expecting that maybe the third cycle we will have some chance to have this live opportunity for the award ceremony. I think what we can do together as a media community in Asia, we can of course bring in the stories that are untold yet, the stories of the marginalized people, the women, the indigenous people, how they have been affected not having equal access to health, they can't access the hospitals, how their food situation has affected, how their income losses have been occurring, how they feel, whether they have lost the family members, the crucial earning people, and how government has been really responding to that crisis, and how prepared are they for future crises. Have they learned anything? Are they putting any plan, as Nipuna said, for the boosters? Are they prepared, God forsakes, if there is a third or fourth or whatever the wave in the countries are coming? So I think these are the stories that will create and keep this debate alive. But because our main concern is rising inequality in Asia, it's a gap between rich and poor, and assumption is that this vaccine inequality has actually exposed the health inequalities and people's access to opportunities. It has left vulnerable people and the kids not to join the schools because they can't have access to internet. They don't have gadgets to attend online classes. So a 2 years lost of schooling is they have been pushed further into the poverty and inequality. So the gains of poverty reduction in Asia was making a great gains in last 2 decades to poverty reduction. That might have been wiped out, or it might take a lot of efforts to bounce back. So in bouncing back or moving forward post-pandemic, what really governments in Asia are doing, I think that's an important point to monitor, to look and find the stories. Are the business as usual? Are still the elite, the rich people, the establishments and the bureaucracies are benefiting? Or they have really made, this pandemic has shaken their conscience? Have the politics changed in any country? Are they making any new policies that really creates a hope and future for majority of the poor people in Asia, and the marginalized people and the groups, especially women and workers in Asia? Is there any improvement in the resource mobilization that can be put in long-term health improvements, investing in healthcare? Is the government devising any plans for social assistance to improve efficiency of the social assistance programs and reaching out to the more people, especially the informal workers who are not part of the formal social protection programs in many countries? Is there any plan to support the workers' rights and union and create more space for the dissent, people to voice? So I think these are the main areas where we really would love to see your stories coming in for the third cycle. So what should a new Asia look like? It's a kind of a reimagining. So the pandemics or wars change the course of history. We have seen as the Europe after Second World War, and this has been a huge crisis, and it's still continuing. It's still in many countries. It is still continuing. So this will be really an important occasion to see how the future should look like from the people's perspective. And so you can talk to the people on the ground and stories, what they feel, what they think the future for them stands, what they would like their governments to do for them to reduce this massive income and wealth gap, but also the gap of power between men and women, between rich and poor, and between ethnic minorities and the majorities. So looking forward, I believe together we can have a great campaign for next 2 months in the media till we reach to the concluding ceremony of the award. And thank you once again for joining this wonderful webinar. Over to you, Richa. Sorry, Shiza.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I think that was very beautifully summed up, because not only did you reflect upon how vaccine inequality is deepening existing inequalities in Asia and what it means for marginalized people. But you also encouraged us to look forward and to think about the future and have left us with a little bit of hope. So perhaps all of us can come together and envision a better future for Asia and add our voice for this movement for a more equitable and just Asia. So with that, I thank everybody who has participated in this very rich discussion and has contributed their time, their comments, and their questions to help us explore this issue further. And a special thanks to all our panelists for sharing these insights with us, and to Asia Center for hosting this space and for encouraging discussion on this very, very important issue. Thank you, everyone. I wish you a good afternoon, a good evening, and a good morning wherever you are and where you're joining us from. This recording of this discussion will be available on the Asia Center's Facebook page. So I encourage you to follow this page and to share this link. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shiza. Thank you, James, and other colleagues in Asia Center.
Thank you. Please
Thanks.
fill out the survey in the chat box when you can. Appreciate it. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.